At 11:43 p.m., October 17, 1777, a man is riding hard through the dark Pennsylvania countryside. No lantern, no escort. He's not a soldier, he's not a courier. His saddlebag contains a document that, if intercepted, wouldn't just end his life. It would collapse the entire American Revolution from the inside. He never made it to his destination. The document was never found, and the man's name was quietly erased from every official record of the war. But here's what nobody ever told you. This happened more than once. There are gaps in the American Revolution that historians don't talk about in classrooms. Missing records, disappeared agents, decisions made in rooms that were never officially entered. A layer of this war so buried, so deliberately obscured, that even some of the founding fathers refused to write about it. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't the revolution you learned in school. It's the one they chose not to teach you. Let's go back to the beginning. The version you already know, 1763. Britain has just won the 7 Years' War, the most expensive war in its history. And now, someone has to pay for it. That someone is the American colonies' new taxes, new restrictions, new humiliations, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to literally house the soldiers occupying them. And the colonists did what people do when a distant empire squeezes too hard. They complained, they protested, they wrote pamphlets. It was political theater mostly. Frustrating, yes. Dangerous occasionally, but manageable. The British weren't particularly worried. These were colonists, farmers, merchants, printers, not soldiers. By 1770, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was tense. But it was the kind of tension that empires had managed for centuries. The kind you contain with the right amount of pressure and the right amount of concession. The story, as most people know it, goes like this. Push becomes shove. Shove becomes Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre becomes Boston Tea Party. Tea Party becomes war. By 1775, Paul Revere is writing. Shots are fired at Lexington and Concord. George Washington takes command of the Continental Army, and America begins its long march toward independence. It's a clean story, heroic, simple. But it's not the whole story. Not even close. Here's something the textbooks skim past. The American colonies were not united. Not really. When the Revolution began, historians estimate that roughly one-third of colonists actively supported independence, one-third remained loyal to the British Crown, and one-third simply wanted to stay out of it entirely. One-third. That's not a revolution. That's a civil war dressed up as a revolution. And that changes everything about what actually happened. Because the British didn't just have an army across the ocean. They had allies inside the colonies. Men who believed, with genuine conviction, that separation from Britain was madness, economic suicide, political chaos, a descent into mob rule. These men were called loyalists, or Tories if you wanted to insult them. And here is what almost nobody talks about. The British were actively cultivating them, organizing them, arming them, not as a side project, not as an afterthought, as a central military strategy. There are letters, some still in British archives, some curiously incomplete, that suggest senior British commanders believed the loyalist population inside the colonies was large enough, organized enough, to crush the revolution from within. The war the history books talk about is the one happening on open fields. Muskets, cannons, redcoats marching in formation. But underneath that war, there was another one. And it was happening in taverns, in basements, in the back rooms of churches and courthouses. It was a war of information, of infiltration, of quiet, invisible violence. And it had no official name. There's a name that doesn't appear in most American history courses. Major John Andre, British Army, head of intelligence operations for the Crown in North America. Charismatic, brilliant, ruthless, in the way that only truly intelligent people can afford to be. Andre wasn't fighting the revolution with muskets. He was fighting it with people. He ran a network, a web of loyalist informants, sympathizers, and double agents embedded inside the Continental Army, inside the Continental Congress, inside Washington's own camp. Some of what he built is documented. Some of it has been quietly acknowledged by historians willing to go off script. But here's the part that never gets the spotlight it deserves. Andre's network didn't just gather intelligence, it shaped events. There are moments in the revolution, critical moments, where things go wrong for the Americans in ways that are almost too convenient for the British. Supply chains suddenly disrupted, troop movements somehow anticipated, letters intercepted that shouldn't have been interceptable. Official history calls some of this bad luck, poor planning, the inevitable chaos of war. But what if it wasn't? What if inside the Continental Army, inside the very infrastructure of the American Revolution, there were people actively working to end it? Not just Benedict Arnold. Everyone knows about Arnold, which is exactly why he's the perfect distraction. The story of Benedict Arnold is the story they want you to focus on. One traitor, one dramatic betrayal. Clean, contained, explained. But Arnold was never working alone, and the people who were working with him, or around him, or above him, those names never made it to the history books. Ask yourself why. January 1778. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The Continental Army is dying, not metaphorically, literally. Men are freezing in inadequate shelters. Soldiers are wrapping their feet in rags because they have no boots. The supply wagons are arriving half empty, or not arriving at all. Washington writes letter after letter to the Continental Congress begging for supplies. Food, clothing, ammunition. Congress does almost nothing. For decades, historians have blamed this on the inefficiency of a young, chaotic government, poor logistics, political infighting. Maybe, but consider this. The men sitting in the Continental Congress were not all true believers. Some of them had family fortunes tied to British trade. Some of them had relatives who were loyalists. Some of them had taken loans from British-connected banks that would evaporate the moment independence actually succeeded. Their loyalty to the revolution was conditional, and conditions can be purchased. There are historians, not the mainstream ones, but the ones willing to dig into obscure colonial correspondence, who have found patterns in the congressional record that are difficult to explain. Votes that should have been easy, delayed for months. Supply requests from Washington buried under procedural objections. Key military decisions stalled just long enough to give British forces a critical advantage. Was it incompetence? Almost certainly in part. But was it only incompetence? Here's the question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. How does an army fighting for its survival repeatedly fail to receive basic supplies, while the men controlling those supplies continue to live in relative comfort? And here's the darker question underneath that one. Who benefited from a long, grinding war that never quite ended, but never quite delivered victory either? Because here's what nobody tells you about the American Revolution. It almost didn't happen. Not because Britain was too strong, because too many people on the American side were willing to let it fail. Let's talk about something called the Culper Ring, Washington's own spy network, one of the first organized intelligence operations in American history. You've probably heard of it. It's been popularized enough that it has its own television series. But here's what the show doesn't tell you. The Culper Ring was created because Washington suspected his own army had been compromised. He didn't build an intelligence network as an offensive weapon. He built it because he didn't know who he could trust inside his own command structure. Read that again. The commanding general of the Continental Army, the man history will immortalize as the father of a nation, was operating in an environment so thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence that he couldn't trust his own officers. Some members of the Culper Ring went their entire lives without revealing their identities. Agent 355, believed to be a woman, a socialite in New York with access to British officers, is never confirmed. Her real name has never been conclusively established. She appears in fragments, in references, in the edges of other people's accounts. And then she disappears. Some believe she was captured by the British. Some believe she was betrayed, not by a British agent, but by someone inside the American network. Someone who knew who she was, someone who gave her up. That person was never identified, never tried, never punished, if that person was never identified. And here's what that means. Inside Washington's own intelligence operation, there may have been a traitor who sacrificed one of the revolution's most important assets and was never caught. So who was running this war? Really? Now let's be honest about something. Because this isn't a story about American heroes versus British villains. The British weren't wrong about everything. The Loyalists, the Americans who sided with the Crown, weren't all cowards or sellouts or collaborators in the simple sense. Many of them were people of genuine principle who looked at the Continental Congress and saw exactly what it was. A group of wealthy landowners and merchants who wanted independence, not for freedom, but for profit. The men signing the Declaration of Independence were, by and large, rich. They owned land. They owned businesses. Some of them owned people. The revolution, in its darkest reading, was not a war of liberation. It was a hostile corporate takeover. One group of elites replacing another group of elites. And the ordinary people, the farmers, the laborers, the indentured servants, the enslaved, they were promised a dream that most of them would never live to see fulfilled. So when Loyalist families were burned out of their homes by Patriot militias, and they were, regularly, brutally, were they the villains of the story? When Loyalist men were tarred and feathered, publicly humiliated, run out of communities their families had built for generations, was that liberty? Or was that a different kind of tyranny? The Continental Army committed atrocities, not just against British soldiers, but against Americans who had chosen the wrong side. Entire communities were ethnically cleansed of Loyalist families, their property seized, their records burned. This happened. It is documented. It is documented. It is almost never discussed in the same breath as the heroic narrative of American independence. And this is where the secret war gets truly dark. Because both sides were fighting a war within the war. Both sides were deploying spies, informants, provocateurs. Both sides were manipulating, betraying, murdering in shadows. The question isn't which side was righteous. The question is whether anyone actually in control of this war cared about the principles they were supposedly fighting for. September 21st, 1780. Near Haverstraw, New York. Two men meet in the dark on the western bank of the Hudson River. One of them is Benedict Arnold, at this point still a celebrated American general, a war hero, a man who genuinely helped save the revolution at Saratoga just 3 years earlier. The other man is Major John Andre. Andre has rowed ashore from a British warship under cover of night. He carries documents that Arnold has prepared, the complete defensive plans for West Point, the key fortress controlling the Hudson River. If the British capture West Point, they split the colonies in two. The revolution doesn't just struggle, it collapses. This meeting is the most famous act of treason in American history. Except, here's the part that almost nobody focuses on. Arnold had been trying to defect to the British for over a year before this meeting. He had sent coded messages. He had passed preliminary intelligence. He had been in contact with Andre, and through Andre, with British Commander Henry Clinton since at least 1779. For an entire year, the most significant traitor in American history was operating openly inside the Continental Army, while Washington's intelligence network failed to detect him. Failed. For a year. A network specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of infiltration. Either Washington's intelligence operation was catastrophically incompetent, or someone was protecting Arnold, or, and this is the question that historians carefully step around, Washington's intelligence operation did know, or suspected, and the decision was made, at some level, to let the situation develop, to see how deep the network went, to use Arnold as bait. If that's true, then the betrayal of Benedict Arnold wasn't a failure. It was a controlled burn. And the people who got caught in it, the soldiers who would have died if West Point had fallen, the agents who may have been exposed in the process, they were acceptable losses in a game being played several moves ahead. Major Andre was captured. He was hanged. Arnold escaped to the British. He lived. He was given a commission. He spent the rest of his life in comfortable exile. And the full network he had been part of, the names above him, the people who had been coordinating with him, the ones who had been receiving British payments that were going through Arnold at all, those names never surfaced. The investigation stopped exactly where it needed to stop to protect the men who mattered. That is not the behavior of a war being fought in the open. That is the behavior of a war with a hidden architecture. Here's something else that doesn't fit the clean narrative. The American Revolution was funded in part by people who had no ideological stake in American independence whatsoever. French money, Dutch banking houses, Hispanic silver flowing through Caribbean ports. This is known, this is documented to a degree, but follow the money a little further and things get strange. Some of the banking interests financing the American Revolution were the same banking interests financing the American Revolution with the same banking interests that had financial relationships with British institutions, the same family networks, the same interconnected web of debt and credit that ran through European finance like a circulatory system. In other words, There were financiers profiting from both sides of this war simultaneously. Men in Amsterdam and Paris and Lisbon who were lending money to Washington's army in the morning and settling accounts with British trading houses in the afternoon. War, for these men, was not a political crisis. It was a business opportunity. And here's the deeply uncomfortable implication of that. If the people funding the revolution had a financial interest in keeping the war going, not ending it quickly, but prolonging it, maintaining a state of profitable instability, then some of the inexplicable decisions of the war start to make a different kind of sense. Why did the British pursue strategies that military historians have called baffling? Why did they win battles and then fail to press advantages that should have been decisive? Why did the war drag on for 8 years when, at multiple points, it appeared to be over? Official history says incompetent generals, political interference from London, underestimation of the American will to fight. Maybe, but what if some of those inexplicable British decisions were the result of pressure, quiet, financial, invisible pressure, from interests that needed the war to continue? What if the revolution wasn't just a political conflict or a military conflict? What if it was also a managed financial event? You're not supposed to think about it that way. That's exactly why you should. Here's a name you need to sit with for a moment. Silas Deane, American diplomat, sent to France in 1776 to secure French support for the revolution, one of the first American agents operating abroad, and one of the most controversial figures in the entire war, for reasons that have been almost completely scrubbed from popular history. Deane secured French support. He arranged for weapons and supplies and military officers to come to America. He helped broker the alliance that arguably saved the revolution. He also enriched himself enormously in the process. He was accused by his own colleagues in the Continental Congress of financial corruption on a massive scale, of using his diplomatic position to engage in war profiteering, of funneling money through accounts that didn't appear in any official ledger. He was recalled, investigated, his reputation destroyed, and then, in the final years of his life, living in poverty in Europe, Silas Deane began writing letters suggesting he had been wrong about American independence. That reconciliation with Britain might have been the better path. He died in 1789, officially of illness on a ship in the English Channel. Unofficially, well, the timing was noticed by people at the time. A man who knew too much, who had been financially ruined and publicly humiliated, who was beginning to talk, dying at sea, just as he was preparing to return to America. The letters he had written in his final months, letters that apparently contained significant revelations about the financial architecture of the revolution, were gathered and controlled by a small group of men. Some were published selectively. Others have never been accounted for. Silas Deane knew where the money came from. He knew who it went to. And he died before he could tell anyone who mattered. Is that a conspiracy? Is it just the tragic end of a complicated, flawed man? The answer might be both, or neither. That's the thing about the secret war. The evidence is always just close enough to be tantalizing and just incomplete enough to be unprovable. By design? By accident? Keep asking. Constance, the aftermath that changed everything. October 19th, 1781. Yorktown, Virginia. British General Cornwallis surrenders. The war, for all practical purposes, is over. Washington has won. America is free. It's the moment the history books were building toward. The triumphant conclusion, the birth of a nation. And yet, within 5 years of independence, the government formed by the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation, had already failed. A completely new constitutional structure had to be hastily assembled. The democratic experiment that the Revolution had supposedly launched was, almost immediately, replaced by a much more centralized, much more elite-controlled federal government. The men who won the most from the Revolution were the same men who had been powerful before it. The farmers who had fought and frozen and bled. Many of them were taxed into losing their land within a decade of independence. Some of them rose up, Shays' Rebellion, 1786, barely 5 years after Yorktown, and were crushed by the very government that claimed to represent them. The enslaved people who had been promised freedom if they fought for the British, and tens of thousands of them did. They ran toward British lines throughout the war, because the British made promises the Americans never offered. Most of them ended up back in chains. The ones who didn't were forced into exile, shipped to Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone. abandoned by an empire that had used them as a military asset and then discarded them. And the Loyalists, the one-third of colonists who had believed in the crown, they lost everything. 200,000 of them were driven out of the new United States. The largest forced displacement of people on the North American continent until that point. No trials, no due process, just leave, or face the consequences. This is independence, or is this just one power structure replacing another, using the language of freedom to launder a transfer of control? The secret war didn't end at Yorktown, it just changed form. So let's come back to that writer. October 17, 1777, 11:43 p.m. The man on the horse, riding through the dark Pennsylvania countryside with documents that couldn't be allowed to exist. We don't know who he was. We don't know who sent him. We don't know who sent him. We don't know what those documents contained. But we know this. Somewhere between where he started and where he was going, he vanished. The documents vanished. And within weeks of that night, decisions were made. Military decisions, political decisions, that historians have struggled to explain using only the official record. Decisions that changed the trajectory of the war. For whose benefit? That's the question the official history can't answer, won't answer. Because the official history was written by the people who won, and the people who won had every reason to shape the story, to decide which names survived and which ones disappeared, to determine what was recorded and what was burned, to construct a narrative of righteous revolution that would inspire future generations and carefully conceal the machinery underneath it. Here is the truth about the American Revolution. It was one of the most consequential events in human history. The ideas it generated, imperfectly, hypocritically, but genuinely, changed the world. And it was a covert operation within a military conflict, within a financial scheme, within a political power struggle. It involved men who believed in freedom and men who were using freedom as a slogan. It was won through heroism and through betrayal and through manipulation and through the suffering of people whose names never made it onto any monument. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the version of the story that leaves out the second part isn't history, it's mythology. Here is what I want you to sit with. The documents that Ryder was carrying, the ones that disappeared on that October night in 1777, they had to have originated somewhere. Someone wrote them, someone gave them to this man and told him to ride, and someone, on the other end of that journey, was expecting them. That person never came forward, never acknowledged waiting, never reported the rider as missing, never raised an alarm about documents that, if they were important enough to require a secret courier in the middle of the night, were important enough to miss. Unless that person already knew they were gone, unless that person had arranged for them to be intercepted, unless the whole thing, the rider, the route, the timing, had been designed not to deliver the documents, but to lose them, deliberately, plausibly, in a way that couldn't be traced back. In a war full of double agents and invisible networks and financial interests that crossed enemy lines, who do you trust? Not the generals. Some of them were compromised, not the politicians. Some of them were on the other side's payroll, not the diplomats. Some of them were enriching themselves from both directions, not even the intelligence networks, because the intelligence networks had been penetrated. So who was actually running the American Revolution? Was it Washington? Or was Washington himself being managed, fed information, positioned, protected, guided by interests he couldn't fully see? Was independence the goal? Or was independence the outcome of something else entirely? A reorganization of power whose real architects never put their names on any document. The writer is still out there, somewhere, in the historical dark. The documents are still missing, and the men who knew what was in them have been dead for 250 years. But the questions they left behind don't go away just because the people who could answer them are gone. History isn't what happened. History isn't what survived. And someone decided what would survive. And someone decided what would survive. Ask yourself who. And ask yourself why the version that survived is so clean, so heroic, so convenient. Real revolutions are not clean. Real wars are not heroic. Real power does not announce itself. It hides. It works in the dark. It sends riders through the Pennsylvania night and makes sure they never arrive. The American Revolution happened, but the war behind the revolution, the secret war, the invisible war, the war that determined who would actually control the outcome, that war has never fully been told. Maybe it can't be. Maybe that's exactly how the people who fought it wanted it. If this changed how you see American history, or any history, Share it with someone who still thinks they know the full story, because the most dangerous belief in the world isn't ignorance, it's the certainty that you already know the truth. The secret war is still happening, just with different writers, different rooms, different documents that will never be found. The question is whether you're paying attention.